Hello, it's Nick. Welcome to my channel if you are new, and welcome back if you've been here before. I hope you've been doing well since the last time we talked. So this is going to be part one of a three-part series I'm going to be doing on my channel titled The Exploitation of George Floyd. Now in this first part, I'm going to be touching on some statistics regarding police brutality to kind of lay the groundwork on what is really happening in the world, especially in America. The part two, which will be about why George Floyd was chosen as the police brutality, murder, and death, whatever you want to call it, to be used as the vehicle for change. And what does the timing of his death have to do with the reason he was chosen? Then we'll move into part three, which will actually be touching on the exploitation of George Floyd regarding mainstream media, politicians, Hollywood, celebrities, and social media in general. So before I share with you the graphics that really illustrate what is going on in the country regarding police brutality, I wanted to share from the organization that I'm taking these stats from, which is called Mapping Police Violence. I want to read their description of their data, which explains how they got the data and why they feel their data is the best out there. According to Mapping Police Violence, quote, law enforcement agencies across the country have failed to provide us with even basic information about the lives they have taken. And while the recently signed Death in Custody Reporting Act mandates this data be reported, it's unclear whether police departments will actually comply with the mandate, and even if they do decide to report this information, it could be several years before the data is fully collected, compiled, and made public. We cannot wait to know the true scale of police violence against our communities. And in a country where at least 3 people are killed by police every day, we cannot wait for police departments to provide us with these answers. The maps and charts on this site aim to provide us with the answers we need. They include information on 1,106 known police killings in 2013, 1,050 killings in 2014, 1,103 killings in 2015, 1,071 killings in 2016, 1,093 killings in 2017, 1,142 killings in 2018, and 1,098 killings in 2019. They note 95% of the killings in our database occurred while a police officer was acting in a law enforcement capacity, implying that 5% of the killings were off-duty police officers. And they go on to say, importantly, these data do not include killings by vigilantes or security guards who are not off-duty police officers. Mapping Police Violence continues by saying, this information has been meticulously sourced from the 3 largest, most comprehensive, and impartial crowdsourced databases on police killings in the country: FatalEncounters.org, the U.S. Police Shootings Database, and KilledByPolice.net. We've also done extensive original research to further improve the quality and completeness of the data, searching social media, obituaries, criminal records databases, police records, and other sources to identify the race of 90% of all victims in the database. We believe the data represented on this site is the most comprehensive accounting of people killed by police since 2013. A recent report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimated approximately 1,200 people were killed by police between June 2015 and June 2016. Our database identified 1,106 people killed by police over this time period. While there are undoubtedly police killings that are not included in our database, namely those that go unreported by the media, these estimates suggest that our database captures 92% of the total number of police killings that have occurred since 2013. We hope these data will be used to provide greater transparency and accountability for police departments as part of the ongoing campaign to end police violence in our communities. So reading this actually made me really trust and know that they've done their due diligence in this research and that they were a legitimate organization. Because I believe when you're doing any research for yourself, you got to make sure you have your BS meter, your bias meter on to kind of make sure you know what you're getting into, so you don't just take everything at face value. When I read this, I felt a lot more comfortable sharing it with you, and of course when I share it with people in person who I know in real life. So let's go on to the great graphics that they have, and I will share them on the screen as well this time. So they started by sharing this dynamic graphic that does a timeline and it plots each police killing as it happened throughout 2019, which I thought was really interesting. So the first thing you see once you scroll past that dynamic graphic, you see a statement made by this organization, Mapping Police Violence, that states Black people were 24% of those killed despite being only 13% of the population. So clearly, this was when my bias filter went off when I showed, okay, they are clearly trying to show that Black people are the main victims of police brutality, which that's what we've been hearing all along. So that really confirms that via this statement. But let's see how they back up that data and what proportion of Blacks are actually being killed versus other races. So immediately you get into a calendar of the year, and it shows that only 27 days in 2019 did we not have police kill someone in America. Which to me was really, I don't want to say it was shocking, but, well, actually, you know what? It was shocking because we don't hear about police killings of people every single day. And that's, I think, the most shocking part, is this is actually potentially more widespread than people even realize. But the problem is we only hear about it every once in a while, at the extent that we've been hearing about it lately, that this may actually shock a lot of people. So the next graphic wanted to talk about how Black people are most likely to be killed by police. On the left side of the screen, it talks about how Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. And it shows that Hispanic people are kind of in between as far as the amount of police killings per 1 million population. Then on the right side, it touches on the fact that Black people are 1.3 times more likely to be unarmed compared to white people, and Hispanic is in between as well. So this does confirm that more Black people per percentage of the population and more unarmed Black men are being killed by police. This graphic doesn't necessarily touch on how they're being killed, whether it's by excessive force or by gunshot, but honestly, it doesn't really matter. They're being killed. So now let's get into the argument of crime related to police killings. Now, a lot of people say the reason Black people are killed more than white people or other races by police is because they commit more of the crimes. While that may be the case that they do commit more of the crimes, whether it's homicide or any other type of crime, this graphic actually partially disproves that. This graphic just considers police killing rates versus violent crime rates. And as you can see, it's organized by police killing rates, and you notice that the highest police killing rate is actually in a city that has a violent crime rate that is kind of in the middle between all the other cities that are on this list. So, and that city was Oklahoma City. So you can see that it depends on location, and the correlation between violent crime rates and police killing rates doesn't seem to be matching up. Now, I would like to see violent crime rates by race versus police killings by race would be an interesting graphic to see, which I don't believe is in this particular Mapping Police Violence organization's data. And then we get to this, which I thought was a really, really interesting depiction of this, where they picked out 2 cities that had similar population and a pretty similar percentage of population that is of people of color, and then they talk about the violent crime rate and versus the police killings. So I thought it was interesting. So in Buffalo, New York, the population is about 250,000, and the percentage of colored people is about 50%, so about half of those. Their violent crime rate is 12 per 1,000, but they had 0 police killings. Whereas Orlando, Florida had about the same population and a little bit less percent of color people of color, and their violent crime rate was actually lower, but they had 13 police killings in Orlando. This just had to do with the amount of police killings versus population and percentage of people of color in that area. And what it showed is that actually this was the inverse. It was actually the lower crime rate city actually had a higher number of people killed by police. So I thought that was a very interesting stat. And then our second to last graphic, which is interesting, but I think the last graphic might be the best, has to do with the accountability of police officers. And what they found was 99% of killings by police from 2013 to 2019 have not resulted in officers being charged with the crime. So they kind of illustrate it here by showing 99 people or 100 people, and officers charged was 3 and officers convicted was 1, which I thought was an interesting display of this. Now, this doesn't account for if they were acquitted or not charged because they were using self-defense, because that is a legitimate reason to use force on someone, right? If you really feel your life is in danger, who is someone to tell you that you can't defend yourself? So I thought that's where this kind of was blinded a little bit. I would love to see that statistic on how many of these cops were using self-defense. Now, if it's a problem where people are using self-defense as an excuse to do things, that is where I see it as a problem, when people are proven, or there's some loophole, or there's some law that's allowing these police to get off with doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So, in my opinion, like a lot of people, I think if you break the law, it shouldn't matter if you're a police officer, a civilian, an elected official, the president of the United States, whatever. If you break the law, you should be convicted, or be charged and be convicted if you are guilty. And the last chart, which I thought was the most interesting because it actually talks about solutions. Usually we see a lot of anger and outrage and not a lot of talking about solutions that are actually working. So I love this chart because it shows solutions that are actually proven to work. So it says police departments that have adopted these use of force policies kill significantly fewer people, but few departments have adopted them. So let's start. I'm going to go from left to right. So on the left, we have a 25% reduction in police killings when they require officers to use all other means before shooting. Interesting. The same amount of reduction, 25%, for police killings happens when they require all use of force be reported. Then 22% reduction when they ban chokeholds and strangleholds. So I think that's very interesting. So then we move on to a 19% reduction when there is a use of force continuum implemented. Basically what that means, I had to look it up, I'm going to be honest, is when they educate their police force on how much force needs to be applied in certain situations. So my understanding of it is, if it's a minor situation where you need to use force, here's like the threshold of what you should be doing so that you do not injure the person. And it kind of goes up from there, like more severe situations, what can you do without basically killing them? So I think that was interesting. Then we move on, a 15% reduction when they require de-escalation. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. A 9% reduction when the duty to intervene if another officer uses excessive force is implemented, meaning like what happened with George Floyd, if those other 3 officers that were standing by as the officer who actually killed George Floyd was doing what he was doing, if they were trained to step in when he was yelling, when George Floyd was yelling that I can't breathe, then that may have prevented his death. So that's proven to be a 9% reduction in police killings. Then there's an 8% reduction when they restrict shooting at moving vehicles. And then lastly, there's a 5% reduction when they require a warning before shooting. Another interesting one. So now that we've touched on the demographics and the statistics behind who the victims of police shootings are, I wanted to make sure I touched on the statistics around who the police officers or who are more common in the police force to be committing these crimes against civilians. What I found was an article from the National Review that was published on July 31st, 2019, so about halfway through last year, which is about halfway through the data that I just touched on from the Mapping Police Violence. It says, a new study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences demolishes the democratic narrative regarding race in police shootings, which holds that white officers are engaged in an epidemic of racially biased shootings of black men. It turns out that white officers are no more likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot black civilians. It is a racial groups rate of violent crime that determines police shootings, not the race of the officer. The more frequently officers encounter violent suspects from any given racial group, the greater the chance that members of that racial group will be shot by a police officer. In fact, if there is a bias in police shootings after crime rates are taken into account, it is against white civilians, the study found. So this kind of clarifies one of the points that I was questioning in the Mapping Police Violence review of their graphics. I was wondering what type of violent crime rate, or if it varies based on certain crimes that are committed by certain race groups or certain groups more often, and this answers my question right here, assuming that everything that they have is correct, which I believe it is, because it is a National Academy of Sciences journal that it was published in, and it does account, and this doesn't really debunk or it doesn't really discount what I talked about previously in this video, because that was mostly about the victims of the shootings, not necessarily the police that are actually committing those crimes. So then they say the authors, faculty at Michigan State University and the University of Maryland at College Park, created a database of 917 officer-involved fatal shootings in 2015 from more than 650 police departments. 55% of the victims were white, 27% were black, and 19% were Hispanic. Between 90 and 95% of the civilians shot by officers in 2015 were attacking police or other citizens. 90% were armed with a weapon. So-called threat misperception shootings, in which an officer shoots an unarmed civilian after mistaking a cell phone safe for a gun, were rare. Earlier studies have also disproven the idea that white officers are biased in shooting black citizens. The Black Lives Matter narrative has been impervious to the truth, however. Police departments are under enormous political pressure to hire based on race, despite existing efforts to recruit minorities on the theory that doing so will decrease police shootings of minorities. Buttigieg, who by the way was running for president at one point, it was actually when this article was published, came under fire from his presidential rivals for not having more black officers on the South Bend in Indiana force after a white officer killed a black suspect this June, meaning June 2019. They also note that the officer had responded to a 911 call about a possible car theft suspect, saw a man leaning into a car, and shot off 2 rounds after the man threatened him with a knife. They continue by saying the Obama administration recommended in 2016 that the departments lower their entry standard in order to be able to qualify more minorities for recruitment. Departments had already been de-emphasizing written exams or eliminating requirements that recruits have a clean criminal record, but the trend intensified thereafter. The Baltimore Police Department changed its qualifying exam to such an extent that the director of legal instruction in the Baltimore Police Academy complained in 2018 that rookie officers were being let out onto the street with little understanding of the law. Mr. Biden's criminal justice plan would require, in response to Joe Biden and his plan as he's running for president, would require police hiring to, quote, mirror the racial diversity, end quote, of the local community as a precondition of federal funding. Then they say this effort to increase minority representation will not reduce racial disparities in shootings, concludes the PNAS study, which is the one I'm about to read a little bit from. Since white officers are not responsible for those disparities, black crime rates are. Moreover, lowered hiring standards risk bad police work and corruption. A 2015 Justice Department study of the Philadelphia Police Department found that black officers were 67% more likely than white officers to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black suspect. Hispanic officers were 145% more likely than white officers to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black suspect. Whether lowering higher standards are responsible for those disparities was not addressed. So they continue by saying the persistent belief that we are living through an epidemic of racially biased police shootings is a creation of selective reporting. In 2015, the year the PNAS study addressed, the white victims of fatal police shootings included a 50-year-old suspect in a domestic assault in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who ran at the officer with a spoon. A 28-year-old driver in Des Moines, Iowa, was exiting his car and walked quickly toward an officer after a car chase. And a 21-year-old suspect in a grocery store robbery in Akron, Ohio, who had escaped on a bike and who did not remove his hand from his waistband when ordered to do so. Had any of these victims been black, the media and the activists would probably have jumped on their stories and added their names to the roster of victims of police racism. Instead, because they are white, they are unknown. So before I wrap up, I wanted to share one more thing and go to the study mentioned in this and share their brief synopsis of their study and what it has found. So what they said is there is a widespread concern about racial disparities in fatal officer-involved shootings and that these disparities reflect discrimination by white officers. Existing databases of fatal shootings lack information about officers, and past analytic approaches have made it difficult to assess the contributions of factors like crime. We create a comprehensive database of officers involved in fatal shootings during 2015 and predict victim race from civilian, officer, and county characteristics. We find no evidence of anti-black or anti-Hispanic disparities across shootings, and white officers are not more likely to shoot minority civilians than non-white officers. Instead, race-specific crime strongly predicts civilian race. This suggests that increasing diversity among officers by itself is unlikely to reduce racial disparity in police shootings. So this actually confirms not only what I talked about in the mapping police violence data, but also fills in those gaps, because that mapping police violence data was just about the victims, not about the officers, and that does match what they're saying here by saying that that database does not have comprehensive information about race and demographics of the police officers. So I thought this was really, really great and why I want to add this in the video. So in conclusion, the statistics that I talked about today show that yes, black people, especially black men, those weren't pointed out here, but you can look up and that's very, very obvious that it's black men and men in general that are more susceptible to police shootings, are more likely to be shot by police officers. But those police officers are more likely to be non-white. So I'm confirming the mainstream media's points, but I'm also giving the facts that they don't want to tell you. So that's what I'm hoping to do on this channel from now on, is really just give the facts, both sides of it, and kind of share the truth. So before we wrap up here, I wanted to ask you a quick question. What did you think of these statistics? Have you seen these before? Have you ever looked them up yourself, or are you curious and are you going to go look into these statistics more? And please join me for part 2 when it comes out by subscribing and turning on post notifications so you get notified when it comes out. And also stay tuned for part 3 as well, which will really touch on the exploitation of George Floyd by a whole range of people. But I think next episode will be interesting to kind of understand the timing, because it's the one thing that you are not seeing in the news, on social media, from politicians, from celebrities. You're not understanding, which is partly the reason why they're all speaking out about this. So I'll just leave it at that. That's a little bit of a cliffhanger, so make sure to come back for there. And lastly, give this video a thumbs up so more people see it, because I feel like the more of us that get this information, the more of us that are in this conversation about statistics and what's really happening, whether it's something you agree with or not, is good for everybody. So with that said, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.